Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
He uniquely provides an insight into the global sweep of KGB operations and what the KGB was up to in every continent, in nearly every single country in the world. We now have an insight into what the KGB was doing.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Please follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. This is the story of how one man, a librarian for the KGB, became a traitor to the intelligence agency, stealing the most prized Soviet-era archives and smuggling them to the West. Historian, journalist and podcaster Gordon Corera, whose new book, The Spy in the Archive, tells the remarkable story of how Vasili Mitrokhin ended up changing the world. A traitor to his country, but a man determined to expose the truth about the dark forces that had subverted Russia, forces still at work in the country today. I'm delighted to welcome Gordon Corera to our Cold War conversation.
I suppose I'd always been aware of Vasili Mitrokhin, the archivist, since he first came to public knowledge, I guess, in 1999, and there was this kind of burst of publicity around that time, which I vaguely remembered. I was a journalist then in 1999, a much younger journalist, and he was one of those names which was, you know, the Mitrokhin Archive, the book, you know, is always up on the shelves, isn't it? And you're aware of it, and it's a reference point. But I then, in the last few years, started to kind of delve a little bit deeper into it. And a few things happened. I mean, one was the last book I did before this was about Russian illegals operating in the United States mainly. And I went and actually looked at what was in the Mitrokhin Archive. And I remember thinking to myself, this is quite interesting, you know. And then you start to think, well, I looked into it and I was kind of wondering as well, when you see in the books that have previously come out that, you know, the story has never been revealed about how he got out, and immediately then you start thinking, that's interesting. There's a story there which hasn't come out. And so I think it was a combination of knowing that this was actually quite an important and interesting figure who'd done something significant, but about whose own life we didn't know that much, and knowing that there was also an interesting story in how he was handled and dealt with by both MI6 and the CIA, set me off on the path. And then it, you know, like all of these things, it's a kind of long and tortuous path researching these books, where you go down lots of alleyways, you're trying to find people, get people to talk to you, and that takes a while. It's not straightforward.
Indeed, and it's a rattling good story. I mean, there's detail in here that I didn't know of, and you have a great cast of characters as well in here, and a lot of assumed names as well. Yeah,
with some of the MI6 officers, I put them under some of the assumed names rather than the real names, which is, you know, fairly standard practice for that reason, including in some cases the names of people who are effectively agents for MI6, not just officers and who work with it in that capacity. So put it this way, there are still quite a few sensitivities around some of the names and identities involved in it. And I should say it's not a official or authorised account. You know, I'm quite clear in the book that I didn't ask for or get any help from MI6 or anything else. But people who did speak to me kind of spoke on, you know, conditions of anonymity and the like when they were talking. So that's often the way you have to go about writing a book like that.
Yeah, I can imagine. So who was Vasili Mitrokhin?
So he was, I think, one of the most interesting, unusual, extraordinary and important spies of the end of Cold War period. In terms of who he was a man who goes on this extraordinary journey from having been a KGB officer and I think a true believer in communism and the ideals of the KGB, and goes on this journey which lasts over decades through discouragement, disillusion, anger, a kind of burning spiritual hatred for the KGB, which eventually leads him to turn against it. And he burns with a real fire, even though he's this introverted archivist. And I think that kind of complicated personality was also one of the things that slightly attracted me to him, because he is complicated. He is in some ways an archivist and a librarian, but he goes on to do the most extraordinary thing, which is steal the secrets of the KGB's first chief directorate, which was the KGB organization, spying on the rest of the world, steals its deepest secrets, copies them, and then eventually will bring them out to the West, courtesy of British intelligence, and then continue his journey to try and destroy and damage the KGB and the ideology behind it. And I think that journey, which is a long journey, which, starts, I suppose, in the 50s and ends with his death in 2004, that's half a century. It's extraordinary, really, of moving in that direction, of taking that path at extraordinary risk.
Now, how on earth do you copy a huge archive like that and manage to smuggle that information out of probably some of the most guarded places in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, how do you steal an archive? And the answer is very slowly and very carefully, and with great risk to yourself. He has the advantage of being an archivist and understanding the archive and being inside the KGB and relegated to the archives from 56. The journey to disillusionment takes years, really crystallizes around the time of the Prague Spring in 68. And then it's still only in 1972 that he starts to copy the files. And he does so because he's fortunate in a way, because at that moment in 1972, the KGB is moving. It's moving from the Lubyanka, the first chief director at the KGB is moving from the Lubyanka, which of course is in the center of Moscow, and moving over to a place known as the Forest on the outskirts. And that process of moving means moving the files. And so over years, he is overseeing that process of the moving of the files. And moving files means cataloguing them, understanding what's in them, which ones are going to be kept, which ones are going to be discarded, and actually overseeing the physical transfer under armed guard from one location to another. And so this gives him an opportunity. It gives him the opportunity to sit in his office, and he's senior enough to have his own office, and to basically read the files. And as he's reading them, initially he tries to memorize it, and then he'll start to take down tiny notes, and just tiny notes in his own shorthand, his own kind of code. And at first he will hide these in his shoe, fold them up, put them in his shoe, and then walk out, because he realizes the guards will search bags, and obviously if you're carrying out a big file, they're going to spot that, but not if you've got a tiny bit of paper in your shoe. And then he'll hide them in different places in his pockets and so on. And then go to his home in Moscow, his apartment, and then on the weekends his dacha, and reconstitute the fragments into files. So effectively copy them out. And he will spend, he will dedicate 12 years of his life, and then more after he retires in 1984, to this meticulous process of copying out every single detail that he thinks is important. And just thousands and thousands of pages that he is doing this for, and then will catalogue and turn them into volumes and really try and work them up into something more coherent. But it is an extraordinary thing to do that knowing any day you could get caught, and the consequences for him, would have been terrible.
And why did he decide to offer these secrets to the West at the time that he did?
Well, he does this copying effectively from 1972 until 1984 when he retires. And he then continues working on the files. And it is interesting because one of the things I do think is unusual, odd, many things are, about the way he acted, was to take these risks, to copy down the archives, but not to have known what he was going to do with them. So he wasn't a spy in the classic sense who was, working on the instructions of a foreign intelligence service, or even had a plan at that point of how to get them to a foreign intelligence service. And I think that's one of the things that's very interesting about them. And he is in a Russian tradition in that sense of writing because you want to preserve the truth in the hope it will one day be published. So writing for the drawer, as they'd called it. And Bulgakov did it with The Master and Margarita, which he kind of wrote for many years, not knowing whether it would ever be published or be safe to be published. Solzhenitsyn does it with the Gulag Archipelago, which is a big influence on him. Again, writing, hiding it, not sure if it's going to be published. And Mitrokhin is doing the same thing with his archive. He's writing it, hiding it under the floorboards of his dacha, unsure what will happen to it. And when he's retired, he looks at different ways of perhaps getting it out. He looks at whether he could somehow smuggle it out through the far east, through Japan, or somehow get over the border to Finland, or if he could take a boat. But the archive by this stage is massive. It's not one book or one box. It's boxes and boxes of files. Not something he could carry out, and which if he was caught, he'd face punishment and he'd lose the archive. So it is interesting that he sits on it and he kind of ponders what to do until, of course, suddenly, and I think to his and to pretty much everyone's surprise, the Soviet Union falls apart. And by the end of 1991, borders are relaxing. And so at that point, he realises the route out is the Baltics, because the Baltic states are away. New embassies from Western countries are being opened up there, but the border controls are weaker. So he can go there to actually try and approach someone and explain what he's got.
And his approaches to those embassies are interesting because, first of all, he tries the US embassy.
That's right.
Can you just explain the story with the US embassy? Because they've got a bit of a history of what you're about to describe.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's early 1992, and these embassies are opening up in the Baltic states, and they are very new. They're quite chaotic. There's a lot of people approaching them, often saying they've got secrets and saying they're former KGB officers. And at the same time, there are instructions from Washington saying, we're trying to make nice with the Russians. We're trying to, build up liaison, including between the CIA and the newly named, Russian intelligence services, the FSB and the SVR. And so Mitrokhin turns up and they turn him away. And it's a really interesting story, and I spent quite a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of it. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it's not well recorded in America because they missed it and they turned him away. And there's at least 3 or 4 occasions, as far as I can tell, where he has contact with American embassies in Riga, in Latvia, and in Vilnius in Lithuania, and is turned away. And in some cases, he has conversations with people. One person takes him seriously, but he's about to leave, so he says, come back. And the next person, I think, takes one look at him and says, you look like a tramp. And it's true. He dressed down, this old man by this stage, about 70 years old, dressed down deliberately to avoid drawing attention to himself. Wanted to look like a kind of ordinary peasant. And so they dismiss him. And in another occasion, it looks like it does go back up to CIA headquarters at Langley. But again, the view is, this isn't the time, we're not sure if he's worth it, not sure if what he's got is the real deal. So they turn him away. And it's really interesting because they this has happened before, and it's happened before in the Cold War where, if you look at the things like the Penkovsky case, where Penkovsky was trying to approach the Americans, American students, American diplomats and others, to try and establish a kind of a relationship. Penkovsky, who was in the GRU, Russian Soviet military intelligence, and they miss him, and eventually he contacts a British businessman, and then eventually gets run jointly by MI6 and CIA. So there is a bit of a history of the Brits picking up what the Americans miss, and in this case, Mitrokhin, having been turned down by the Americans, goes to the British embassy in Vilnius and knocks on the door. A cold call, opens the door, wants to speak to someone from the special services, MI6. There isn't anyone there from that, but there is a young woman who is in her 20s, who's a British diplomat, but who speaks Russian, and who just sees that he might be interesting, and so offers him a cup of tea and has a look at the papers that he's brought with him, and just thinks this could be real. The papers are strange, she's not sure about them, but it could be real. And so she will then contact MI6 and start a process by which he will work with MI6 over the coming months and years. But it's a close call. I mean, you think there's a bit of me which kind of wonders, especially as I talk about it now, it would have been so easy, wouldn't it, for him to have either, been turned away again, to have got caught, or something else to have happened. And it would all have been lost. All his work and all the knowledge that came from it, could easily have been lost. And it makes you also wonder how many others were lost. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and that British diplomat, she's sort of like an unsung hero, really, of this story. Again, there's no name there, but I'm sure she presumably had quite rapid promotion after her success there. Now, MI6 bring in a couple of interesting characters to meet him the next time he arrives at the embassy. Could you just describe these two? Because they are intriguing.
Yeah, so the message goes back to MI6 from the embassy that there's someone to meet and that he's going to come back the following month. And so MI6 have to work out who to send out to meet him. And there's a lot of these kind of people offering secrets at the time, and they've got to work out, is this person worth meeting? They're also, like the Americans, not sure if he's for real. There's a question about whether it's a dangle, because the KGB and then later the Russian intelligence agencies, as the Western did, would dangle false defectors into embassies precisely to, often to identify intelligence officers and to waste their time and send them down the wrong paths. So the decision in MI6 is you don't want to send, a young, clean-skinned officer unknown to the Russians out there in case it is a dangle. So they're going to send two very interesting, extraordinary individuals who go by the name of Robert and James. And James is a kind of real veteran MI6 officer in his 50s, been around the block, worked around the world, kind of slightly worldly wise. Robert is, I think, I would say, in all the years I've covered this, one of the more extraordinary characters I've come across, who I think could be from a John le Carré novel, because he's Russian. He's an émigré, exiled Russian who is now working technically as an agent for MI6. So he's technically an agent being handled by James, yet actually Robert in some ways is almost co-equal with any MI6 officer at the time, and people who knew him definitely describe him as that, and as a very forceful personality and someone in whom played an important role in MI6 at that time, partly because he knew Russia. It's not just about knowing the language, it's knowing the culture, it's having the experience of the KGB. Just gave him an insight which was irreplaceable when doing things like meeting defectors and going to talk to them, because he had an instinct for knowing whether they were the real deal or not, or how to handle them, or what to tell them, or what the process should be. So quite an unusual character in many ways.
Yeah, I think in the book he's described that he could smell a KGB agent at 100 paces.
That's what they thought. He could just tell. He just instinctively had this feel for them. It's like a superpower, people said. And so he will be one of, the two of them will go out to meet Mitrokhin in April when he returns to Vilnius. And Robert will kind of go, yep, he's the real deal. He seems like the real deal. As they meet him and as they're shown the papers and they look at, some of those archives he's brought out, which are pretty valuable papers at that time. The things he's bringing out in those early visits are files about deep cover KGB illegals, the kind of deep cover spies who take on different identities to live undercover in the West. And this is, these are kind of crown jewels stuff for Western intelligence who are looking for those spies.
Absolutely. And what were Mitrokhin's terms for handing over this information?
Well, they very quickly work out that he is not an easy man to handle. He's introverted, quite voluble, quite, he's got a temper, quite demanding. And the two demands he has are that when he is ready, he wants MI6 to get both him and his family out. That's the first demand. And the second one is also perhaps the more unusual of the two, which is he also wants his files, his archive, published. He wants the material to be made public. And I think that tells you quite a lot about him. I mean, firstly, it's unusual because, most spies who are bringing out, technical secrets or something like that wouldn't want that, and they wouldn't necessarily want their role to be known and so on. But it also tells you both a bit about a kind of ego, maybe, that he wants it published, but also that his mission, as he sees it, is to expose to the world the truth of the KGB. he is not someone doing this for money. He's not making demands about money. He certainly, has personal demands, but actually his kind of burning mission is to try and destroy the KGB and the Chekist ideology behind it. And he believes the only way of destroying it, of killing it, is by exposing the truth about it and what it has done, including what it has done to Russia in his mind. So he is very much, in his mind, a Russian patriot who sees the KGB, the Communist Party, the nomenclatura, the Soviet elite as having corrupted Russia, and he wants to free it by destroying this kind of beast, and he really does see it as a beast, which has taken control of the country, and so publishing the archive is part of that intrinsic mission that he takes so seriously and that is driving him.
Now, we mentioned earlier that he wants his family exfiltrated as well. Now, they haven't been told or don't even know what he's been up to, which does pose a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the bits that I found so interesting about it, is that, the book is about the history of the KGB, of the Cheka, the Cold War, but it's also a personal drama and a family drama about one man and his complicated relationship with his family. As I said, very introverted, hasn't told his wife what he's doing. I mean, he spends, which is also, again, seems extraordinary that he's able to spend all his time working on this archive in his apartment in his dacha. And his wife, she's actually a very successful, eminent doctor herself, an academic doctor, ear, nose and throat specialist, who has her own career and is kind of very established. And she doesn't know anything until quite close to the point where he's going to be exfiltrated. So and he's going to get them out. But he also wants his mother-in-law to come out, because he knows his wife wouldn't leave her alone. And then crucially, his son, Vladimir. And the complication with Vladimir is that he is in a wheelchair. He has a muscle wasting disease, which they haven't been able to diagnose. And is another one of the things that is driving Mitrokhin. I think lots of things drive him: grievance, anger, this kind of ideology about Chekism, but also I think frustration about his son not being diagnosed, not being treated, and the desire to help him. And so he is doing quite a lot of this for his son, but he's not told him. And that's the thing I find, so interesting. And so you get to the moment where he's going to be exfiltrated in November 1992, and they're heading for Lithuania, and his wife now knows, but his son and mother-in-law still do not know where they're going. They think they're going for medical treatment. They don't realise they're actually on this kind of wild exfiltration mission.
And there's a great scene in the book in the docks where, as you said, the Baltic states are still very porous at this time. So there's a worry that the KGB will interfere with the exfiltration.
Yes, because technically the Baltic states have declared independence and have independence. Of course, that's one of the reasons the Soviet Union, collapses. But equally, the Red Army is still in Lithuania. I mean, there's still thousands of soldiers in Lithuania, and the KGB, now FSB, has a huge presence and still has networks of agents there. And it's one of the reasons it's thought too dangerous to fly, because the airport will still be under their control and they'll spot him coming out. So there is real concern about this exfiltration of this family. And so they come up with a scheme in which they'll go by train to Vilnius from Russia, and then they will be driven in this tiny minibus to Klaipeda, the port up on the Baltic coast, from where they'll take a boat to Sweden, and it's a kind of Swedish intelligence helping MI6 to do the operation. And it does nearly go wrong. I mean, it's one of the kind of dramatic scenes, the centerpieces of the book, is where the son finds out as they are heading to the boat what's going on. It suddenly dawns on him that he's leaving Russia and never going back, and that his father is, in his mind, a spy. And the shock for him is enormous. And so it becomes a very difficult moment, which nearly derails the whole exfiltration, because he's shouting and screaming, not willing to move. They can't get his wheelchair up the gangplank onto the boat, so Robert, the Russian MI6 agent, is going to have to effectively, carry him and take him on board the boat to get them out. So, and I don't think the mother-in-law either really knows what's going on the whole time. So it's a kind of extraordinary family drama as well as a big spy story as well.
In that sort of relationship between his son and Mitrokhin himself is an interesting one, because they clash, but then it becomes a much closer relationship when they move to the UK.
Yeah, and I found that really interesting as well, because there is this moment of high drama during the exfiltration. But I think you can understand why. The son is leaving, he's not had an easy life, and he's having to leave that behind and the friends he's got to suddenly go, to the West. But he comes to terms with it on the boat itself. There is still a bit of resentment, I think, from the son in the subsequent years, for the next few years. But actually it will change over time. And I think it's, on a personal level, one of the more heartening bits of this is how the son, actually, who's never had the easiest relationship, I think with the father in Russia, actually comes to respect him and what he's done. And that after Mitrokhin will die in 2004, it's the son, Vladimir, who's then known as Peter, takes on a British name, will see it as his role to preserve his father's legacy by trying to finish some of the books his father was working on, and by finally giving the files, the raw archive that had been brought out to Churchill College, Cambridge, where it's now, deposited by Vladimir, by the son, and available with just a few exceptions for researchers and everyone to go and look at.
Yeah, we'll come back to those exceptions in a moment, because I'm intrigued by those. Now, setting up 3 new identities for somebody and somewhere to live and all the associated expenses is a significant amount. And MI6 find that the bean counters in the British government are saying this is too expensive. We can't afford this.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? You've got this amazing intelligence defector full of the secrets of the KGB, which no one has seen. And the Treasury is like, yeah, I don't think we can stump up the cash for that. I mean, it's quite redolent of today, dare I say, in Britain today, where, the money's not quite there in the way it used to be. And this is, early 90s, the peace dividend, the Treasury, it's cutting back money for intelligence and defence and things like that. And so MI6 actually have a problem at one point where they're like, we've promised to get him out. We promised to look after him. We don't have the money. And so what they will have to do is turn to the Americans. and fortunately, the Americans stump up $1 million, and that's the CIA and FBI who agree to fund, Mitrokhin's life afterwards. I should say, when you hear about $1 million, it sounds like, oh, he's going to be rich. But actually, that's what it costs, because you've got to buy a house for someone. You've got to set them up with pension or some kind of income. So it's not as if you get $1 million into your bank account, and that's what it would, that's a kind of minimum to really look after a family who've defected. But they get that from the Americans. So the Americans end up paying for the defector who they turned away. Now, even that, though, is quite interesting, because I spoke to some of the Americans, who were involved at the time, and they said, well, yes, we did end up paying, but in some ways, maybe it wasn't so bad, because we got access to the files and to the archive, and we didn't have to handle him, and he was hard work to handle. So there's a bit of a view of like, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds from the Americans in the long run, a few thought.
Indeed, because obviously Mitrokhin wants to get this book published, and he's introduced to Christopher Andrew, who has already done various intelligence histories. I think he did the official history of MI5. He
did that a bit later. He'd written some books at that time with Gordievsky.
Yes.
After Gordievsky came out, Instructions from the Centre and a few other things. So he was already established as the kind of preeminent historian of Cold War intelligence. So Mitrokhin gets out in 92, but it's secret. This isn't public. And one of the other bizarre things I think about the operation, which I think is also remarkable, is it looks like the Russians don't realise he's gone. Because of course he's retired. It's very different from other spy cases, when you think about it. He's retired, and they come up with a way of trying to suggest that he's always at one of his other dachas, and that he's still picking up his pension, and that he's no one's bothering to ask. And of course, one of the things that's interesting about it is he hasn't, if you like, stolen any files. He's copied them. Nothing's missing for anyone to notice that's missing. So for years, he's effectively, it's quiet that he's left in 92. But then in the mid-90s, Christopher Andrew is let into this secret that there is this amazing defector. And they will go to start on this process, which will take years and be quite complicated and quite difficult, of producing a book which will fulfill the promise of making Mitrokin's work public, which eventually will happen in 1999. But it is not, I have to say, an easy journey. And that was one of the things I discovered, while researching this, was just how difficult it had been. I mean, the relationships do break down between Mitrokhin and Christopher Andrew at one point, and between Mitrokhin and MI6 as well. As I said, he's a difficult character. He is obsessed with making everything public. So I think what was interesting is he didn't want his work to be edited, didn't want it to be added to or changed, just wanted the raw material out there. He had this view which was, the truth is enough. All you have to do is put this truth out in front of people and it will, change the world. And of course, Christopher Andrew and the publishers and all look at it and go, no one's going to read this unless it's turned into something more approachable and more understandable. And there's a tension as well over, authorship, as you might expect. There's a tension over what the emphasis should be and what the audience should be for a book. If you're a book publisher, you want to sell books, which is different from Mitrokhin, who's trying to, if you like, reach the Russian people. So there are all kinds of tensions which make it a very, very difficult process. And I mean, at one point, I was told Mitrokhin, wanted to pull the plug on it, or on that version. He was so unhappy with it. And there was actually an argument over copyright. And one of my favourite stories is, there's an argument over, well, who owns the copyright to this? And Mitrokhin is kind of suggesting maybe he can pull the plug. And someone from who was then at MI6, said, maybe it was thought better of suggesting that the people who really own the copyright are probably the KGB, given it was their files. But they weren't really in a position to object. So everyone was just going to go ahead anyway.
Brilliant. And what secrets did the files reveal? What were the big shocks in there?
Well, see, that's such an interesting question, because I think this goes back to partly why I wrote the book, because what became news were very specific stories which were seen by journalists, and I'm afraid I spent most of my career as one of those journalists, as newsworthy. So, for instance, in Britain, famously, it was a woman called Melita Norwood. And Melita Norwood, it turned out, had been providing atomic secrets, in the crucial period of the 40s and 50s, from Britain's atomic weapons program to the Soviet Union, and was still alive. And this was a kind of extraordinary revelation. There was a huge interest in her, and she was tracked down. And in America, it was the idea that there were weapons caches, which the KGB had created, not just in Europe, but it was thought in America as well. And they had sabotage plans for New York and all these other places. And so you could see that the publicity around the book and the way it was received got diverted into very specific areas. And of course, what a lot of British people were interested in was, well, what does it tell us about Kim Philby and the Cambridge Five? What was known about them? And things like that. And then later on, there's a book which comes out a few years after the first volume. The second volume looks at the rest of the world. Huge revelations about, for instance, India and other countries and what the KGB had been up to. I think the tragedy for Mitrokhin himself was that he was more interested in explaining what the KGB had been doing to the Russian people. That was his interest. And that was not the focus necessarily of the book or the publicity around the book. And I think that was one of the difficult things. But when you look at the book now, and they are big books, but they are extraordinary books. And on every page, there are extraordinary secrets from the KGB's files about operations, running deep cover illegals to pretend to be Westerners, but who are actually KGB officers spying on the Prague Spring, and spying within the Soviet bloc. Some really interesting revelations there. Revelations about lots of these deep cover illegal spies. Enormous detail about what the KGB was doing in Africa, in Asia, as I said, in India. So many countries. I mean, so many, in the Middle East, the identities and the fact that it penetrated Israel, Egypt, all these other countries. So it's almost too much. I think that was one of the problems, is this was just this kind of wave of material. And it came out the first volume in 1999. And I think at a moment when, as well, we'd come to think of the Cold War as history, which of course on one level it was, but not something which had any continued relevance. We'd put it aside. We thought we'd moved on from it. It was matters of historical interest. But the Mitrokin's message that actually there was something dangerous about the ideology behind the KGB and that it might persist, I think that was lost at that moment. And I actually think those books and Mitrokin's story look more interesting today than they did in 1999 when they first started to come out. And I think more relevant when we can see what's happened with Russia since.
I bought the book when it came out, and I've got it on the shelf here behind me, and it is a real doorstopper. But as you say, you dive in there, and I had before we were going to do this interview, I thought I'll have a quick look in there, and there were some cases that I'd forgotten about. I mean, there's John Simons, the copper, so a British copper who was a KGB Romeo agent.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's extraordinary. I mean, that is just one of the stories in there. And he denied it, and then when the book comes out, he kind of admits it. But again, a bit like the Melita Norwood story, the story with him and with her was, well, why wasn't he prosecuted? So the story is turned back into, why did MI5 fail to prosecute these people? And, same within America, why did the FBI not uncover these arms caches? And were they still there? And where might they be? And what threat did they pose? So actually, a lot of those stories were kind of missed. And I think it's been interesting researching this. I've looked at some of the people who've in turn gone into the archives and researchers who've gone into there from particular countries, whether it's Armenia or Israel or other countries or Italy, have found extraordinary stories in the Mitrokin archive, whether it's the book or the original archive, because it is packed full of details. I mean, packed full of details and stories which you won't necessarily still find many details of anywhere else.
Is anybody working on new stories from that archive based around that?
Well, I do know. I mean, Sean Walker, who's written a very good book on the illegals and Russian spies, just come out a few months ago. He went back through it, and found some really interesting details there. So I think, researchers and academics and journalists are working through it and finding really interesting stories because they're there, But, the original archive is in Russian. And I think you do need to go back to that source and then be able to kind of look at it and translate it and understand it to know what it is. And it takes some work. I mean, that is one of the challenges with Mitrokin's work, is it does, it sometimes it is fragments and bits and pieces when you look at the original archive, and it is hard to understand without having an appreciation of how those pieces of the puzzle fit in with other things. So it's not easy, but if you put in the hours, there's treasure there, I think, for researchers, and there will be for years to come.
I'm sure there is. I did interview Sean when his book came out, and that was fascinating because he did talk about those Prague Spring illegals, as well as the Canadian family, the Heathfield Follows, which was a great story. But I think one of the ones I'd love to see was another one of our former guests, Jack Barsky, was revealed by the Mitrokin archive, and I had a 2-episode chat with him, and his story was incredible, from his recruitment in East Germany through to essentially evading the KGB recalling him back by saying he had AIDS.
Yeah, I've spoken to Jack as well, and I think he's a fantastic individual, really interesting, absolutely amazing to be able to just talk to someone who's lived as an illegal, and it's this really interesting story where he was actually their KGB's nightmare to some extent. He was the dream agent, he's an incredibly smart guy who goes and lives in the West, but then he kind of enjoys life in the West, and he meets a woman, he gets married, he has a family, and so he decides, I don't want to be a spy anymore. And so I think he comes up with a story, doesn't he, that he's got AIDS and that he's dying, in the hope that the KGB will leave him alone, and which they seem to. And he is living, in, I think, Pennsylvania then in the 90s, completely under the new Jack Barsky identity, not doing any spying. And then Mitrokin comes along and reveals who he is. And that sets the FBI on investigating him and eventually confronting him. And it was interesting because I asked him, I said, well, what do you make of Mitrokhin now? And he kind of, because of course he ended his life as it had been, which was living a normal life, and exposed him, which for most spies would be a disaster. But he had this kind of complicated relationship anyway, where he'd moved on from his spying. And he said, I think he said something like, I'd be thankful for him because he allowed me to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. This kind of complicated identity he'd had. It forced it out by being confronted by the FBI, thanks to Mitrokhin, for him to, come to terms with it and be who he was. And I thought, how interesting, for someone to view it in that way. But Mitrokhin did lead to some other prosecutions as well, of Daniel Lipka, who'd been a spy in America's NSA in the Cold War and had never been known or caught. George Trofimov, who'd been an American kind of military colonel and who'd been a quite significant spy, again, and had passed information through his kind of foster brother, who was a Russian Orthodox priest, because a Russian background family. Again, Mitrokhin was vital in helping him be caught and prosecuted. So, like as with Barsky, there were quite a few spies who were caught, Cold War spies, who were caught thanks to it. But I did speak to one kind of spy catcher who was frustrated because he said to me, there were lots and lots of others who they found out about through Mitrokhin, and the countries didn't want to deal with it. These were, that there were cases, lots of cases in France. There was a very important, clerk in the French Foreign Ministry had been provided some really important communication secrets, still alive. The French kind of were, didn't want to deal with it. Lots of countries. Mitrokhin provided evidence of people who'd been spying for the KGB, and those countries just didn't want to kind of deal with it. It was just much better, particularly at that point in the 90s, to just sweep it under the carpet and forget it ever happened. And that caused some frustration, I think, for people.
Now, you mentioned earlier about there's some aspects or areas of the archive that aren't available to researchers. What do you think's contained within those?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, because when you go there, there are files and bits of files which are redacted and still redacted. Now, and there are actually still quite strict conditions around the use of the material. And one of the problems, and this was always a slight problem with Mitrokhin, was there are so many names in it. There are so many names of people who had contact with the KGB. In some cases, those people were fully paid up agents. In some cases, they were being cultivated. In some places, they might not have known they were being cultivated, but they were, and their names are in the files. And I think one of the concerns was privacy. One of them was libel and some of the legal issues around it. Because, of course, one of the risks was, and this was one of the challenges, was do the files themselves constitute proof? They are copies of original files. Is it the same as proof, isn't it? It's kind of interesting legal issue. And I think in some cases there were people or agents who were sensitive. And, I think it's noticeable that actually some of the Western files, US and UK, are the more censored than any of the others. So, you're left to wonder what's there. And, most of this stuff, if you think Mitrokhin retired in 1984, so most of it, is at least, 40 odd years old. Most of the people you'd think now have died, but clearly it's not guaranteed that everyone would have done, or that there weren't some cases that were sensitive or ongoing investigations. Be surprising now. I think also, there were some interesting things where I think people suggested to me there might have been, double agents, if you like, who'd been dangled by the West, or where there was a kind of complicated spy game going on where they might have wanted to keep that redacted. So, yeah, and it's hard to know exactly how much, but there are, most of it is public, but not everything.
Intriguing. And the files cover the KGB, but you've got the GRU as well running their own agents. So there's a whole tranche of that side of things that we still don't have visibility of.
Yeah, and that's right. So there's GRU files, and there's files as well from different directorates of the KGB. So Mitrokhin was the archivist for the first chief directorate, which did spying abroad, but you've got, second and others who did domestic surveillance and spies. And one of the interesting things is there's always been question marks about whether some particularly sensitive agents were recruited and run by the second chief directorate or a different directorate and not the first, and whether some of the most sensitive files, he had access to not quite absolutely everything, and whether there were some extremely sensitive files, even from the first chief directorate, which were kept from him. But yes, I think there's an enormous amount there, but it is not necessarily absolutely everything. And there are there's interesting stories because when he comes out, the Americans are desperate to get hold of Mitrokhin and to talk to him after 92, because some of them in the CIA know that they've got potential moles in the US intelligence community, and they want to identify them, and they're hoping there might be some clues in the files. Now, in the end, it will turn out that the penetrations the US have, there's a number of them, but the big ones are Robert Hanssen and Aldrich Ames. Now, Aldrich Ames was a CIA officer who only approached the Soviets in 85, so after Mitrokhin had retired. Robert Hanssen, though, had originally been run by the GRU from, I think, 79, but because Mitrokhin didn't have access to GRU files, as you noted, he didn't have the goods on him, and which meant he was still, I think, till 2001, able to spy for many years on. So yeah, it's not a total record of every spy the Soviet Union had in the West, certainly not.
Yeah, because I think that there were two British cases. There was Michael Bettany and Prime. Can't remember his first name. Jeffrey Prime, who weren't in there as well.
Yeah, or hints towards them, but not the full story. Yeah, so it was not complete, so there needed to be quite a bit of detective work still to kind of piece together what was in the archive.
And when you look back at Mitrokhin in terms of his importance, how would you describe his importance in Cold War history and in the history of big reveals of intelligence?
I think of the First Order, and I really, really do think that, because I think it's interesting because he only comes out as the Cold War's ending, so you wouldn't say that he is a spy who, if you like, shapes the contours of the Cold War as it's happening. In a way, you can say Penkovsky, plays a role, his intelligence, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or, some of the atomic spies play a role in the Cold War for the Soviet Union in helping them develop the atomic bomb, or Philby's role in the Cold War, or Gordievsky in the 80s. So he's not playing a role in the Cold War in that sense, but his significance for our understanding of the Cold War, I think, is second to none, because I think he uniquely provides an insight into the global sweep of KGB operations and what the KGB was up to in every continent, in nearly every single country in the world. We now have an insight into what the KGB was doing, into who might have been on the payroll, what covert informations it was running, what disinformation campaigns it was pursuing. That is a unique insight into the KGB, which was one of the preeminent players in the Cold War, which we can now understand from the inside, from its own archives, in a way that I think is astonishing. So I think, in that sense, for our understanding of the Cold War, he is absolutely first rate. But I also think he has this importance because, in his later days, everyone thought Cold War over, even 1999, Vladimir Putin coming to power. Yes, he's a former KGB man, but, people in the West, even in MI6, thought he was someone they could do business with. Mitrokhin could see this was a former KGB man. He could see the continuities in Soviet, then Russian intelligence from the Cold War through to the 1990s and into the 2000s. So he could see that rather than seeing the Cold War as something distinct and which stopped, of course it did on one level, but Russian intelligence continued, and I think the important concept there is of the checker. the Dzerzhinsky's, committee, extraordinary committee for kind of counter-revolution established by Lenin at the start of the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, the Cheka changes names. It becomes the OGPU, the NKVD, the MGB, then the KGB. But the Chekist ideology persists. And of course, Vladimir Putin still calls himself a Chekist. And Russian intelligence officers still call themselves Chekists. They still celebrate Chekist Day and talk about Chekist days. They still say once a Chekist, always a Chekist. And Mitrokhin could see this and try to warn people about it and could understand it. So I think, as well as being a historian and a unique insight into the Cold War, he gave us this perspective that the legacy of the Cold War is still there in Russian intelligence, and that there is a continuity in its operations through this notion of Chekism. And I think that is also what makes him so important.
And also there's a continuity of the techniques that the KGB were using even to the present day. I mean, the use of illegals is still, a feature of their intelligence services.
And because a previous book was on illegals, and again, I thought it was fascinating because you had these illegals who'd been sent out by the KGB in Cold War days, who'd sworn their oath of allegiance to the Communist Party. The Communist Party disappears, the Soviet Union collapses. They keep spying for Moscow. They're not withdrawn. They don't stop. They keep going. What does that tell you? It tells you those illegals were serving something other than just the Soviet Union or just the Communist Party ideology. And I think it suggests, and it is complicated, but there is a kind of, their loyalty was to some concept of the motherland which persisted, despite the end of the Cold War. And I think that the illegals are a good indication of that, and of the persistence of some of the thinking, but also some of the techniques. And you can absolutely see the echoes today of those Cold War techniques of Russian intelligence, whether it's the use of illegals still going, whether it's the use of disinformation campaigns still going, and so-called active measures, whether, the sabotage operations. People are talking a lot about Russian sabotage in Europe and operations. Well, actually, you go back and look at the Mitrokhin archive, and you can see the plans and the work that went on for sabotage by KGB departments back then in preparation for conflict, or even to undermine things, or some of the kind of assassination operations which were going on, which again, you can see the continuity today. So I think this idea of continuity between past and present is something that Mitrokhin really shines a light on.
Absolutely. Gordon, is there anything else you would want to tell the listeners of Cold War Conversations about the book?
Well, I just hope it helps explain an extraordinary man, because I think he was a really interesting man who took extraordinary risks and who really believed in what he was doing. And I think, I think he deserves recognition for what he did, but I also think what he did matters today. And so that's why I think, I found it, so fascinating, really, to kind of delve into his story.
You've been listening to Gordon Corera talking about The Spy in the Archive, how one man tried to kill the KGB. There's links to buy the book in the episode information, and any sale helps to support Cold War Conversations. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War Conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.